Rav Shagar went through the Yom Kippur War, and many people say that it influenced the way he thought about life, about God, about religion. He was shot in a tank, and two of his friends in yeshiva were killed. He himself survived. So Levi, I want to ask you, how do you think this affected his thinking, and do you think it dramatically affected the way he thought about God, or maybe he was going towards that way anyway?
So there's a documentary about Rav Shagar by a man named Rabbi Morrow, who actually was not really a student of Rav Shagar's. In fact, he felt he sort of missed out on being a student. He interviews someone, I don't remember if it was Rav Shagar's wife or his sister or someone, who said that Rav Shagar was really always a very sort of pessimistic, almost depressive thinker, and very introspective, and not, particularly enthusiastic or positive. So in that sense, I wouldn't want to attribute those aspects of his thought to the Yom Kippur War. What I see as the significance of the Yom Kippur War is his relationship to Zionism and religious Zionism specifically. He will often attribute the Yom Kippur War as he'll attribute to the Yom Kippur War the falling power of Zionism to inspire people, and the lowering belief in Zionism amongst Israelis more generally, and say that the Yom Kippur War sort of showed the problems with Zionism and things like that. Regarding religious Zionism more specifically, there's a very powerful story I heard in a lecture from one of his students, Rav Elchanan Nir, who said that he had heard from Rav Shagar when Rav Shagar was in the hospital, in the Rambam hospital up in Haifa, after he had been very severely burned in the tank. He had this feeling that just like he is, bandaged up and hospitalized, so too religious Zionism has bandaged up and hospitalized the Torah. And the idea of the Torah being hospitalized and sort of confined to the Torah and confined to the hospital was it something he felt the need to fix. The same way he was going to leave the hospital, so too the Torah had to be brought out of the hospital.
That's really interesting. And this is kind of why I want to talk about the Yom Kippur War in general. I find it fascinating about Rav Shagar, and in this way he's very much of an existentialist. Real concrete things that he went through in his life shifted and affected his thought processes, and it wasn't like he had a concept that he grew up with and he wasn't going to budge on it, and that's what it means to have faith, is to always be consistent. Rav Shagar in many ways is the opposite. He really believes that life's experiences should shift and should affect your thought processes. So it's interesting that the Yom Kippur War, you said it, he might have also had this type of more somber and dry attitude towards life beforehand, but I do think, especially in his drashot, his essays on Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim, he does talk about how much he felt that God was, he says, almost like a shadow, tzel. He didn't feel like God was there in the war. He felt like God was absent. So maybe you could talk a little bit about Rav Shagar's relationship to God as a shadow, rather than as maybe, the sun.
Well, I'm not sure to agree on God not being there so much as God being there as a shadow as opposed to as light. One of the important things about Rav Shagar is that he's very much within the religious Zionist story, which starts from Rav Kook. And all of Rav Kook's works are called orot, the lights of holiness, lights of repentance, lights of Torah, just lights. And so the idea that faith and light are somehow connected, that God and light are connected, is sort of Rav Shagar's starting point. And so when you see he's writing about or speaking about the Yom Kippur War, suddenly he makes it very clear that's not the case, that faith and God are much more connected with shade and shadow than with light. And he likes to work off the Zohar, which describes the Sukkah as Tseil HaEmunah. And he talks about it in his drashot for Sukkah, but also for Sukkot, but also when he talks about, there's a drasha, sort of speech he gave in commemorating the people who died in his tank, his tank mates. And there he says that, it's the emunah is a form of shade and shadow, just like the Zohar says Tseil HaEmunah. And then he also invokes a midrash from Shir Shirim Rabbah about how the Jews, as opposed to the nations of the world, were the only ones who wanted to sit in the shadow of God and the shade of Har Sinai and receive the Torah. But the Midrash compares it to an apple tree which doesn't have any shade, and everyone runs away from the fact that there's no shade. Only the Jewish people are willing to sit underneath the apple tree. So the striking thing there is that God, Shagar is saying we have to be willing to sit in the shade of faith, which is the shade of God, which is not any sort of sheltering shade whatsoever.
Do you think that the shade for Rav Shagar means living with doubt, living with uncertainty, not as something like a tragedy? Oh, it's terrible, now we live in a world where there isn't certainty, there aren't miracles, but almost like Rav Shagar has made peace with the fact that, we don't have certainty about anything, not about relationships, not about God. It's not about even, I don't think he's talking about proofs. He's just talking about it on an experiential level. We look at the round of the world and, especially if you're in the Yom Kippur War, like let's take the 6-Day War as kind of a comparison. 6-Day War, everybody talks about the miraculous way that God was present and self-evident and Hashem saved everybody. That's one narrative that the religious Zionists took. Yom Kippur War, in contrast, really was this sense of, where was God supposed to be, and why didn't we know beforehand it was going to happen, and why did so many people die on Yom Kippur itself? You can't, there's no greater symbolism of the Day of Atonement, and bad things happen to the Jewish people. So, what do you think Rav Shagar's relationship to doubt and uncertainty is? Do you think he's upset, but now we have to deal with it, or is he almost, I don't want to say excited, but he thinks it opens up a new religious experience, living in the shade rather than in the light?
I'm not sure I would actually connect the shade and uncertainty so strongly. I do think that you could make that connection, but I think for Rav Shagar, the idea of living with faith as a form of shade, a shade that doesn't shelter you, is in fact sort of take a step beyond living with uncertainty and gets down to the question of what leads to uncertainty and doubt. Because as a general rule, we feel uncertainty and doubt because of the dissonance, the difference between the way faith says the world should look and the way it actually looks. And Rav Shagar is going to challenge that idea that faith says the world should look a certain way. The idea that God should have saved every soldier in the Yom Kippur War. And for Rav Shagar, the Yom Kippur War is a very strong instance of that kind of faith and that kind of God, where you recognize that it doesn't promise everything that's supposed to be good and everything will be great and just happy and stuff. And Rav Shagar really wants us to be able to live with that. When he talks about bitachon, he again invokes that midrash about the shade of the apple tree that just isn't there. And he refers to what can be called bitachon she'einenu mavtiach shum devar, bitachon that doesn't promise you anything. The having bitachon in God is about recognizing that your commitment to God is not connected to and not dependent on the idea that you'll receive certain things from God.
It's really interesting to read a religious thinker. This for me was one of the first experiences that I'd ever come across where I'm reading a rabbi, someone who is supposed to be the symbol of faith and emunah, the role model, and all of a sudden I'm reading someone who's talking about, where is God in his life? There's no promises, like you just said, that being religious will lead to something concrete in my life. And I think at first when I was reading it, I was kind of turned off it, but I kept on reading because it was intriguing. But the more I read about more Rav Shagar's writings, the more I feel attracted to his realism and his honesty to say, you know what, if you're a person of faith, look at the world around you, stop trying to create these ideals that you've read in a book and say, force it on the world, and actually be honest, the world is not the way it's written about in the text. And that tension for Rav Shagar, I think, has to be there for a religious thinker, and he doesn't run away from it. And that's why when he talks about Zionism, I find it so compelling, because anyone who's really, really read the early religious Zionists, Rav Kook's one of them, but not only Rav Kook, there's this extreme naivety to everything is working out, history is working perfectly, there's going to be this Mashiach, Messianism, everything is working towards redemption. And when you read Rav Shagar, it's this feeling of hold on, life Zionism, the state of Israel, isn't what you guys are talking about. So if you're going to continue talking about that, you're just going to be divorced from reality. So I want to ask you, just on a personal level, what was it like for you to read Rav Shagar's writings on Zionism, when he talks about Yom Kippur War? Was that refreshing for you? Was that at first startling, like the way I described my own experience? Like, how did you feel toward that?
I think refreshing is a better word than startling. I also think I would use the word freeing. I think in a certain sense, what Rav Shagar is often doing is trying to free our religious language from the very specific meanings we've given to it, and that it doesn't always need to have those meanings. So a really good example is in an essay called Chok Ve'ahava, Law and Love in Bayom Ahu. He talks about redemption, and basically says that religious Zionists have a very, very specific understanding of redemption, and it involves the fact that redemption is an ongoing process. It's going to happen in certain steps, and if you take a step back, then that's a whole crisis, and he's dealing with the issue of the disengagement from Gaza when he talks about that. But also he's dealing with the rising post-Zionist and anti-Zionist feelings within the broader Israeli population. And he wants to do there is say, we need to reopen up the word Zionism to other meanings, and the word redemption to broader possibilities. That redemption doesn't have to look like what we've always thought it looks like. So for me, terms like redemption and bitachon and Talmud Torah and all Brit, these are all words that I always felt like they had very specific meanings, and I often struggle with those meanings, feeling that I was, in adhering to them, not able to necessarily really confront the world in front of me. I was always turning aside to the words.
So you found Rav Shagar freed you to be in touch with reality, and the words should not be like a mask.
Yes, Rav Shagar really wants us to embrace our religious language and hold on to it and maintain it, and never ever consider freeing ourselves from it, because it's such an important part of who we are and our breach with God. But he doesn't want our religious language to keep us from really experiencing reality.